then we're going to jump straight into the Yosef narratives. As usual, what I'm going to be doing is we're going to be taking a specific text or narrative, reading it together, reading the pshat, reading the basic text, and then we're going to jump into 3 or 4 dominating themes that we're going to unpack philosophically and theologically, and also obviously at the same time trying to understand it from the perspective of the text. So that's essentially what we're going to be doing this year. So I'm going to begin as I always begin, saying that every year when I drive to my first class, and you are my first class of the year, I'm going on from you to other classes, I still, year in after year, have this, I guess you would call it imposter syndrome, where you're kind of driving and thinking, why would people be coming to listen to me in front of a class? What do I know? What have I got to give over? And I know that sounds cliched, but it is specifically very, very true. And I think that in a sense, sometimes when I stand in front of a class or I write something and I put it out there and I publish it, or I think to myself, it's a little bit arrogant. It's arrogant for me to think, why should my idea, have any holding? Why should it have any foundation? And at the same time, there's moments when I feel like something's come to me and I have to get it out there. It's like that feeling of like, if I don't share it, then what's the point? And in some ways, this kind of very personal, I'm telling you from a very personal point of view, it's almost this dialectical tension. And those of you that know me know that you love, I know that I love the idea of dialectical. This dialectical tension between, in some sense, hubris and humility. And this is a theme I want to develop by way of introduction to our course. And it works very, very nicely with Yosef narratives as well. Because I think that all of the Yosef narratives, and in fact, if we look at the personality of Yosef himself, Yosef really kind of swings between hubris and humility in many, many ways. And not, by the way, just on a metaphorical level, but actually on a literal level. If you look at the way he begins with his dreams where he's on top of everybody and then he goes down into the pit and then he comes back up to become the king and then goes... There's this constant movement with Yosef between hubris and humility, between feeling that he owns the world, and then at other times feeling God is with me and I'm nothing. And I want to just work through this idea with you in terms of the development of philosophy and in terms of the development of culture. And I want us to then jump into seeing how we're going to look at it in the text. So I want to begin with the idea of modernity. In a way, what happens when we move into the modern period, so we begin with, for example, Spinoza, okay? And Spinoza, we know, naturalizes religion. He essentially says there's no metaphysical realm, okay? There's nothing above just the here and the now and nature and everything that we are grappling with in terms of the world in which we live. There's no mystery. Essentially, Spinoza kills off mystery. He kills off metaphysics, right? And he says that everything that we encounter, everything we see, can be explained. It can be explained through science, it can be explained through nature, etc., etc. Okay, then we have Nietzsche that comes along, and he doesn't just take it on a literal kind of physiological level. Nietzsche takes it on a theological level. And he says to us, yes, he carries on the road of Spinoza, and he turns around and he says to us, it's 100% true, and it's even more true theologically. We are living in the era of the death of God. Why the death of God for Nietzsche? Because we don't need God anymore. We don't need that theological idea of this domineering authority that comes down and gives us morality and laws that we have to live by. We are autonomous individuals. We are people that can create the laws. And then we have, for example, Kant's categorical imperative, etc., etc. Okay? So again, he kills off God, he kills off metaphysics. Okay? Then we have, and these are philosophers that I love, right? Then we have people like, you may not have heard of them, Taylor's, Giddens, Weber. These are all what they call philosophers of the modern period. And they talk about what modernity did. And the theme that these philosophers bring in is a theme of what they call disenchantment. Okay, disenchantment. Giddens also speaks about dismembering, which is when we've kind of, the small communities that we used to live in, we're dismembered from the small communities and we move into the big urban kind of metropolis. And when we move into that metropolis, then something happens to us psychologically. I don't want to go there for now. We're going to touch on that later in the year, okay? But I don't want to go there for that for a minute. What I really wanted to talk about is this idea of disenchantment. What does it mean? So it's exactly what we've been speaking about. It's the theme of the loss of magic, the loss of mystery. By the way, Darwinism is the same idea, and it all happened around the same time, right? Darwin also came and he said the survival of the fittest. He basically says there's no hashgacha pratit. He doesn't use those words, clearly, Darwin, right? But he essentially says there's no divine providence, there's no big plan, there's no destiny, there's fate. And what does fate mean? Fate means that there's clearly, naturally, only the fittest are going to survive in this world, okay? And again, what I'm trying to show you is in like one sentence, summarizing like last 200 years of philosophy, but basically in anthropologically for Darwin, what happens is the same as theologically for Nietzsche, and the same as what do we say with theologically for Nietzsche and Spinoza, right? That there's a naturalization, that we don't need to look to any higher realm to explain our reality. Our reality is simply explained by the world in which we live. Okay? Now, why am I bringing all of this to you today? By the way, postmodernism, that's a whole nother thing, okay, comes on the heels, but very much on the heels of the Holocaust, where you realize modernity doesn't work, okay? All these grand narratives don't work, but I don't want to get to postmodernism now, okay? Postmodernism, by the way, has a lot of positives. It speaks about, instead of speaking about objective truth, objective reality, it speaks about subjective truth and subjective reality. And I think there's a lot to be said for postmodernism, a lot of positives to be said for postmodernism, especially on the heels of the Holocaust. But one thing that it led to, and this is going to be very important for us, is what we're seeing today culturally, which is radical individualism, right, which is essentially egocentrism in many ways. And the other thing it led to is extreme relativism. Okay, which essentially says there's no truth, but my truth is right for me. Now, why is that so bad? Because really all of these things has led to what we're seeing today, which is total polarization. And when total polarization happens, really we go back in some ways to modernity. What do I mean by that? I know we're getting very philosophical very early in the morning. Okay, we're going to get back to the text in a minute. But the reason why I'm doing you all of this is because I'm going to show you the Ramban in a minute. I'm going to explain to you why the Ramban is so important for us today. Okay, Robert Putnam, who has a very well-known book. It was one of the most well-known books in America a few years ago. It's called Bowling Alone. Rabbi Sachs also quotes him many times, and he sociologically speaks about the idea that a lot of people, we used to go bowling together in groups, right? There was social interaction. Now people go bowling alone. And he says that phenomenon reflects what's happened to society. That we've become a society that is so enwrapped in our own individual subjectivism, our own individual experience, our own individual truth, that we've actually forgotten even to interact with other people around us. Okay? And by the way, also, okay, we'll come back to, I'm going to leave that for now. So what happens? What happens is that when I become engrossed in my own experience, my own individual experience, I believe ultimately what happens, my group, my experience believes that they hold the truth. And then we have a monopolization of truth. Rav Benny Lau gives this famous story that he went into a school. Why did he start 929? Because he went into a school, a Chiloni school, and he began, as Rav Benny does, in a kind of comic way. He holds up a Tanakh and he says, I found this on the way into school. Who does this belong to, right? And one of the girls, and he said, innocently, very innocently, just turned around and says, Ze lo shelanu, right? Ze lo mipo. It doesn't belong to us. And he said at that moment, the penny dropped on him that the religious groups, or religion, I should say, has monopolized the Torah, has monopolized Tanakh, and it has to be given back to the people. And that's why he started 929. Now I think, or one of the reasons, right? And I think that's true for everything today, not just in terms of Tanakh and religion, but in terms of generally, right? I hold a monopoly on the truth, and I'm not interested in what anyone else has to say. Now, if we look at social media, anyone that's watched The Social Dilemma will know, social media exasperates this problem, because on your feeds and what you're seeing, you're only seeing things that reverberate with your own truth. Okay, constantly. You're only seeing things so you're not actually seeing anything outside of yourself. So what's happened is that instead of us winning back autonomy and freedom and liberalism and becoming people that can open up barriers and seek the world, and we're no longer having to be under the authority of religious, Christian, or whatever it is, Jewish, whatever it happens to be, authority that tells us what to believe, that we believe we can go out and we can believe anything, we can be anything. What's happened is the absolute opposite. Instead of having that autonomy, that freedom, that wide spectrum of opinions from which we can choose, we in the end have ended up today being so parochially set in our own kind of narrow view that we don't even realize it. Okay, now, what's this got to do with anything? Yeah.
I've just noticed that you need to take a step over that way.
Is that better?
People on Zoom.
Better?
You're good.
See, top. Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. So here I want to talk about what my aim is. My aim in the class, and it always is in every class that I've been teaching, is to win back curiosity. Okay? To win back curiosity, to win back mystery, to crack open, in many ways, our minds. And as I say at the beginning of every course, and last year was very specific, because when we studied the problem of evil, it was even more so. But even this year, we're not going to leave the class with answers. Okay, we're not going to be able to walk out the door and say, right, I have something that fits, it sits very nicely in the box, that will stay with me now for the next 50 years, 100 years, however old we are here, and I don't need to look back and worry about it. No, that's not, I don't believe that that's what is called living and growing. What we offer, or what this class will offer, is a plethora of responses, and a response is very different to an answer or to a solution. A response grows, it constantly changes, it's dynamic. So that's what we're going to be doing. We're going to be winning back curiosity. And what do I mean by that? So first and foremost, there's two ways of doing that. One is through humility. There is no question that when one approaches a text, one has to do so with humility. When one approaches anything, honestly, anything, relationships, dialogue, social interactions, knowledge, okay, it always has to be from the perspective of humility. And the second is to uncover the hidden mystery. Okay, what were Chazal trying to tell us? What's hidden underneath the text? So I want to begin with the Rambam. I think the Rambam, in his Hakdamat Bereshit, speaks so beautifully and so powerfully and brings us this idea of what humility is. So he says as follows. Yeah, are there... בשם האל הגדול והנורא, התחיל לכתוב חידושים בפירוש התורה. Okay? In the name of the great, awesome Hashem, obviously, I'm going to begin to write new interpretations of the Torah. B'yama u'b'yir'ah, baretet b'ziyah b'morah, right? With fear, with trembling, right? With sweat, with dread, like literally the way he's describing it. מתפלל ומתוודה, בלב נדחה ונפש שבורה. Right? He's turning around and he's saying, I am praying and I'm confessing before you with a broken soul. שואל סליחה, מבקש מחילה וכפרה. Right? Already before he's even begun to give his chidushim, and here, by the way, he says chidushim. He says, I have something new to bring. I have something novel to bring to the world. But I'm doing it from the perspective of Yir'ah. Remember I don't know those of you remember at the beginning of last year in our introduction, I focused in on the idea of Yirat Elokim as a mechanism for learning Torah. Right? And this is literally what the Rambam speaks about. Right? That with this Yir'ah, that's how, and he says, B'kida u'bivricha uba hishtachviyah, right? I'm literally, what does he say? I'm kneeling, I'm bowing to the ground and prostrating myself. Ad sheyitpakaku kol chuliyot shebeshidra, right? Until all the vertebrae of my spine are loosened. Okay? Now, this movement, the way he describes it, the image of him bowing, and anyway, the image of bowing down is literally that image of humility. That I know that I want to bring a chidush, but I'm bringing it from the perspective of someone who's bowing before you. V'nafshi yoda me'od yediyah brura, right? And my soul knows with clear awareness she'ein beitzat hanamala k'neget al gilgul ha'alyon tze'ira kasher chachamti ktana v'deati k'tzara k'neget sitrei haTorah. He says, I know that the egg of the ant, right, is small in comparison to the atmosphere, right? Meaning, what's he saying here? He's saying, I know there's perspective. It reminds me of last year we looked at Eov, and what was God's response to Eov? He took him on like this tour of the cosmos, right? That's what it sounds like. That I realize that I'm nothing in comparison to the sphere of the universe, right? And my wisdom is so small against all these hidden things of the Torah. I'm going to stop there for now, okay? And he continues all the time speaking about all the various things that are sealed and hidden and things that I don't know, okay? But at the end of the day, he says, I'm coming anyway with what I have to say. And I think there's something immensely powerful in this, right? In fact, if we look at Rav Soloveitchik's writings, a lot of Rav Soloveitchik's writing, one of the, Rabbi Reuven Ziegler wrote a book on Rav Soloveitchik. In fact, I bought it. And I think to me it was like, I saw it on my shelf as that's exactly what we're talking about. The book is called Majesty and Humility. It's named after one of his essays, one of Rav Soloveitchik's essays, called Majesty and Humility. And what Rav Reuven Ziegler says in the book is if we look at Rav Soloveitchik's writings, the majority of them, the motif that runs through them is the idea of majesty and humility. And I see that in the Ramban, right? The idea that on the one hand, if you look, for example, those of you that know his famous essay, The Lonely Man of Faith, you have Adam 1 and Adam 2, right? And Adam 1 is much more majestic, and Adam 2 is much more like a farmin hadama, much more kind of humble, etc., right? Constantly there's this dialectic between being, right, majestic and being really dust of the earth. And I think in so many ways, if we, like the oscillation that happens between these 2 points are in many senses what kind of it kind of pushes us. It pushes us because it allows us to go forward in a majestic way. We're human beings. We can bring chidushim. We have things to bring to the universe. God created us here to be created beings. And at the same time, it stops us from becoming too egocentric, too arrogant, too blinded to other people and to other views, which is exactly what is happening today. Okay? If you want to argue that the pre-modern times, we were too humble, we were too much like dust of the earth. We had to listen to all the other authorities, but not to our own authority. We were very, very kind of behind, archaic, so to speak. What happens with modernity is we break out of that humble status, right? We want to become more majestic, and modernity allowed us to be more majestic, right? Rav Soloveitchik speaks about the idea that Adam 1, the fact that man can fly from Boston to, I don't know, give me another place, Los Angeles, I don't know how far they are, right? Within a matter of an hour or a couple of hours. That is dignified. That's majestic. That's man being able to... But the danger of that is exactly what's happening with modernity. The danger of majestic man is that I become so egocentric, so arrogant, that I lose sight of anything else around me. And we know that that is exactly what happens today. So that's the Rambam. And now I bring Avraham Yeshua Heschel. This is a quote I traditionally, and I haven't given 1 year without, that I bring every single year to the introductory course. Because to me I love it. Irrefutably, indestructibly, never wearied by time, the Bible wanders through the ages, giving itself with ease to all men as if it belonged to every soul on earth. It speaks every language and in every age. We all draw upon it and it remains pure, inexhaustible and complete. In 3,000 years, it has not aged a day. It is a book that cannot die. In fact, it is still at the very beginning of its career, the full meaning of its content having hardly touched the threshold of our minds, like an ocean at the bottom of which countless pearls lie waiting to be discovered. Okay? And why do I bring it every year? Because to me, it really represents exactly what we're talking about. On the one hand, we are bringing Chidushim. Every generation has been given the gift of being able to uncover something in the text that hasn't been given before. And I always say this, that our generation, I really feel that the women scholars that are now writing and teaching, right, bring a whole different perspective. That's why for me it's super important always to bring women, Aviva Zornberg, Yael Ziegler, women that have written, to bring them into the source sheets, to bring them into the class, because they bring a perspective that I believe this generation is the chidush, so to speak, of this generation. Okay, so that's what Heschel's saying. Every generation has the ability to uncover those pearls. Now I want to share with you a source from Yalkut Shimoni. It's actually a source that Aviva Zornberg quotes. Yeah, of course. Yeah. You're all welcome. The beauty of being in class is obviously whenever, yeah.
We have a physics teacher at school who just put out a book. I haven't seen it yet, it's just coming out. He wrote about Briat HaOl, and he explained it through physics. He says if you use physics, there's certain things that weren't explained till now that you can use physics to understand much more deeply. He started explaining to me, I'm not even going to go into it here, but it was fascinating because he literally brought up certain psukim that we understood on the surface but not deeply enough, and physics helped explain it in a very fascinating way. And Rabbanim saw what he wrote and they were flabbergasted.
Wow.
It was amazing. Yeah.
Wow. So Nahon, in every generation there's something new. I think even in the sense of like modern psychology and philosophy, it allows us to like throw light on something that we may not necessarily have understood before, but is hidden there within the text. Now again, I don't want to get into it now, because we actually focused on it a lot last year, but there's also a question of how much the reader reads into the text or how much he reads out of the text. Okay? How much am I reading, how much I am imposing onto the text, or how much am I taking from the text? And I think that's a big question. We're not really going to engage with it so much in the class this year. We're going to just let it flow. But it's a super important question, and it should be a question that's always at the back of our minds. When we're interpreting text, we should always be asking ourselves, am I reading into it or am I reading out from it? Okay, and I think what the exegesis of Chazal is very, very different to modern exegesis, very different. Okay, and perhaps modern exegesis reads more into the text than Chazal read more out of the text. Whether one is right or one is wrong, again, it's up for debate. But again, these are all questions that are very, very important. We don't have time now to go into, because the methodology is a whole course within itself. And I don't think I'm qualified enough to be able to do that. But anyway, so let's jump to Yalkut Shimoni. Yalkut Shimoni is a kind of midrash on the Torah, and he speaks about this idea of, let's just see, I'm going to read it with you. I'm going to read it quite quickly and translate it as we go. So it's basically talking about the idea of when Moshe has to go and tell Aaron that he's going to die. Okay? God says to him, I'm embarrassed. I don't want to go and tell Aaron that he's going to die, but you need to go and do it. השכים בשחרית, והלך לו אצל אהרון. התחיל קורא אהרון אחי ירד אצלו. אמר להם, מה ראית להשכים ולבוא כאן היום? Okay, so he woke up Aaron, he said, listen, I've seen something, I need to tell you. He says, what? Why have you come to me? אמר להם משה, דבר מן התורה הייתי מההל בלילה. There was something in the Torah that I was kind of mulling over at night. ומתקשה לי, and it was really difficult for me, I didn't know what it was. Therefore I got up in the morning and I came to you. And he said, what is it? I don't know what it is. He's forgotten it. Right? Moshe says, I was going over something and I can't remember what it was, and now I've forgotten it. But no, I know it was for sure in Sefer Bereshit. So he bought it and they put it down. ועל כל אחד ואחד אמר יפה עשה ויפה ברא הקדוש ברוך הוא. And they started reading Sefer Bereshit, and at each point they turned around and they said, wow, this is beautiful what Hashem created, this is incredible. וכיוון שהגיעו לבריאת האדם, אמר משה, מה אומר לאדם שהביא מות לעולם? Okay, and then Moshe, they come to the creation of Adam, and Moshe says to Aaron, what do you say about the fact that God brought death into the world? אמר לאהרון, משה אחי, לא תאמר בדבר הזה, אין אנו מקבלים גזירה אלוקים. A bit like what Eov's wife says to Eov. Sorry, I keep going back to Eov today, I don't know why, right? She says to him, you're not going to take the good with the bad, right? Meaning, so Aaron says to Moshe, you know what I think about death? It's part of life, right? We can't have the life without it. It's part of it, right? היך ונבראו האדם וחווה והיך זכו לי"ג חיפות שנאמר בעדן גן אלוקים הייתי והיך אוכל מן העץ ונאמר לו כי עפר אתה אמר לי לאחר כל שבח הזה וכך וכך והגיעו ואמר לי אני ששלטתי במלכי השרת I'll explain it all in a second ואתה שעצרת את המוות לא צפונו לכך עוד כמה שנים Okay, so one second. So he says to him as follows. He turns around and he says to him, Aaron says to Moshe, listen, right, we have to accept it all, right? We ate from the tree, right? We're like dust, and we have to accept all this great praise, right? Adam and Chava merited many great things, 13 canopies, it's like a midrash, 13 weddings, okay? And all of these other beautiful things that we got, right? And you were able to reign over the ministering angels, he says to Moshe, right? And you managed to stop death in various points. Meaning what he's turning around to Moshe and he's saying is, on the one hand, yes, there's death in the world, but on the other hand, look at the power that we have as human beings. We're able to have joy, right? The chuppah. We're able to reign over the ministering angels when we need to, right? We have also a lot of autonomy and power in our hands. And then he turns to him, how many years have I got left to live? Okay, I don't know why Aaron would suddenly say that. Amalek tanohen. Moshe says a few. Haya yored, ad shehiskir lo yom hamavet. Okay, he went down and went down and down until he got to the day of his death. Miyad higishu atzmotav shel Aaron goa. He begins, his bones start quaking. Amale shama bishvili hu advar. Amale hen miyad ra'u oto Yisrael shugar. Kumato, right? Yisrael sees that, and again, the imagery here is super, super important. Bnei Israel see that when Aaron suddenly realizes he's going to die, his stature shrinks. Okay, so again, we have that imagery of the humility of the coming down in stature, that death, mortality, forces us to be humble. Okay, I think it's such a super important concept, that the fact that we are mortal, the fact that we don't know the day of our death, the fact that we know at some point we're going to disappear from the world, that should force us to be humble. That should force us to realize, ultimately, we're afal min hadama, right? Amale Aaron libi chala b'kirbi v'yemot naflu alai. Amale mekubal lech lamut, amale hen. Okay, eventually Moshe says to him, fine, you accept that you're going to die? And Aaron says, yes, I accept. I want to read what Aviva Zornberg says here, because not only does she read this midrash in terms of the midrash about what we spoke about, humility, and the midrash about mortality, she doesn't really touch so much on mortality, that was more like what I saw of it, but she reads it in terms of text, right? How should we read a text? She says like this: Moses is faced with a task that God himself finds shameful. How to tell Aaron of his imminent death. He approaches the subject by indirection through a reading experience in the book of Genesis. So first and foremost, says Aviva Zornberg, Moshe has been given the task by God to tell Aaron he's going to die. How does he do it? He does it first and foremost through a learning experience, through learning the text. In doing so, he models for us a way of reading. He introduces his project by calling out Koreh to his brother. The word is identical with the word for reading. Let us read the book of Genesis. So first he says he's Koreh la'Aaron, and then he says Bo nikra, let's read the text. The word is identical. This gives us a sense that to read, especially to read the mikra, is to call out for a response to a text that itself calls out, summons and addresses the reader. In this case, Moshe and Aaron will read in order to find the lost Devar Torah, the word, the idea that troubled Moshe during the night. Moshe had interrogated the text of the book of Genesis by bringing it into the closest confrontation with the lies of Aaron and himself. What's Aviva Zornberg saying here? She's saying when we read a text, what are we doing? Number one, we're trying to uncover something we've lost, okay, which is exactly how Heschel describes it, the pearls at the bottom of the ocean. We're trying to uncover something we've lost, number one. And number two, we're trying to use it to grapple with our existential reality. And to me, that's so much of what Torah is, right? For me, Torah isn't just an archaic book that I address, I go to, read once a week, and leave. To me, if it doesn't speak to me in my moment of existence now, then it's not Torah Chaim, right? Torah Chaim is that it speaks to me in my existential moment, right? During the pandemic, it was really, really amazing that Torah learning became so much more widespread because of Zoom. People were able to tap into so many different learning opportunities. And there was something that wasn't lost on me in that sequence, in the sense that when we are suffering, when we are facing uncertainty, when we are in some kind of existential crisis on a mass level, right, on a kind of universal level, Torah acted as some kind of cathartic therapy. And it's not lost because there's something, if learned in the right way, Torah is therapeutic. There's this the idea that if you're not feeling good, then Torah's healing. But it's healing because there's something about it that should speak to. If it doesn't speak to us at our existential level, then something's being lost. And that's exactly what Moshe is saying to us, or the Yalkut Shimoni is saying to us here. Moshe then reads himself and Aaron into the text, making death a matter of personal, looming, and tragic import, until Aaron reluctantly realizes perhaps the word, the mystery, the terror, is for me. Strangely, with all the terror of such an intimate reading comes a sense of destiny, of existing in the mind of God, of being oneself the subject of God's words. Essentially, to read is to invite the text to yield up its meanings. Moses, more questioning, more restless, is also a better reader than his brother. He is not entranced by the words of the text, but senses what is hidden in the spaces between the letters, in the silences between the words. What is hidden is, essentially, the reader's most intimate life. The things and words of the night, fears and longings and questions, it is these that I have tried to hear from within the text of the Torah. The experience of highest tension between immanence and transcendence, between the limits of human experience and the signals of transcendence that are secreted within these limits, is what draws me in the biblical text and in the midrashic and later versions of these texts. There is a sense of the turning point, the fulcrum of a transformation that affects the characters in their relations to God, to each other, and to themselves. Ultimately, the interpretive act becomes similar to the creative act. One reads and one begins to hear a certain hum in one's ears. The hum in the ears of the reader generates a personal response to the text. There are, of course, decorums and limits to be observed, but the intimate encounter between self and text must create something new, neither stale nor shabby, in Wallace Stevens' words, but with the essential thisness, which is the classic midrashic description of what it is to receive the Torah. On this very day, they entered the wilderness of Sinai. Torah should be new to you as if it were given on this very day. What Aviva Zornberg is saying here is, if the Torah does not speak to me at this given moment, then it won't ever speak to me. Meaning it has to speak to me at this given moment. And in order for it to speak to me at this given moment, it requires... Okay, and by if it doesn't speak to me at that given moment, then it's not worth anything, right? But how can it speak to me? It speaks to me between the silences. It speaks between the silences. Now I want to tell you about, as I approached, and now I want to get to the wilderness of the text, vulnerability in text reading, which we're going to talk about in a second. But when I was reading the Yosef narratives, it's such a classic story. I remember when I was a kid, I went to Yosef in the theatre. I went to watch. And I took the soundtrack and I used to listen to it all the time. I loved it. I was like literally obsessed with it. And I used to sing it and whatever. And I think I fell in love with the Yosef narrative. Number one, because the music was great and Jason Donovan was great. But besides for that, no one here knows who Jason Donovan is. Clearly not Australian or English. Okay, Lonora. But besides for that, there was something about that story that spoke to me. Siblings, arguing, family dynamics, we all have it, right? In fact, if you look in the Torah, what's really ironic, there's no perfect family. Not one perfect family. Think about all of the great people in Tanakh, everyone. David, Avraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Moshe, nobody, right? And Yosef and the brothers, even more so. These are who we named up. This is Yisrael. This is Bnei Yisrael, and they throw their brother in the pit, and they whatever plan to kill him, and now with adult eyes, I look back to this and I think to myself, oh, my family's not so bad actually. You know what? When my girls are arguing, you took that dress without asking me. Okay, Lorna, as long as you're not throwing you in a pit and planning to kill you, everything's fine. But the point here is that there's something intrinsically approachable about these stories. Now, on the one hand, yes, on the one hand, no, because they're archaic, they're old. But what's in between the text? What's the text really telling us? How does it speak to me in my moment, here, today, as a modern Jew, in the modern state of Israel, who has a family, who's bringing up a family, who maybe brought up a family, who is engaged in interdynamic relationships, etc. So what does the text say to me? And I think in order to find that, we have to read the text very carefully. And that sometimes means reading the silences, reading between the lines, exactly what Aviva Zornberg said, finding the thingness, thisness, not thisness of the text. And in order to do that, I go back a step back to the hubris and humility concept, right? In order to do that, we have to be humble. And what does that mean? So here, Aviva Zornberg brought the beautiful Rashi that speaks about the idea that why is the Torah given in the wilderness? Because we should accept the Torah every day as if it's new. And why does the wilderness allow for us to do that? And here we get back to an idea that I did address last year as well, right? But it's so important, I want to bring it here from a different perspective. And that is the idea of vulnerability in text analysis. What does it mean to be vulnerable? And what does it mean to be vulnerable when I approach a text? So first and foremost, let's just read Bamidbar Rabbah. I'm going to read it in English. And Hashem spoke to Moshe in the wilderness. Why in the Sinai wilderness? From here, the sages taught us that the Torah was given through three things: fire, water, wilderness. How do we know it was given through fire? And Mount Sinai was full of smoke, and it came up in fire. How do we know it was given through water? The heavens dripped and the clouds dripped water at Sinai. And how do we know it was given through the wilderness? And Hashem spoke to Moshe in the Sinai wilderness. Why was the Torah given through these three things? Just as fire, water, and wilderness are free to all the inhabitants of the world, so too the words of Torah are free to them. As it says in Yeshayahu, oh, all who are thirsty, come for water, even if you have no money. Okay, so number one, the first thing here is that the Torah is open to everybody. That the Torah is pluralist. That the Torah is literally open, and this is exactly what I said to you, the story of Rav Beni Lau expresses this idea. Nobody has a monopoly on the Torah. Not even the Jewish people. Okay, nobody says it's mine, and my interpretation is the only interpretation that counts. My way of reading text is the only way that counts. I have a monopoly on how the text is going to be given over and understood. No. Says the Midrash here, the fact that it's given in the Midbar is testament to the idea that the Torah speaks to each and every person. So that's one idea. Why else? And God spoke to Moshe in the wilderness. Anyone who does not make themselves ownerless like the wilderness cannot acquire the wisdom of the Torah. Therefore, it says the Sinai wilderness. Okay? And the second idea is, what does it mean, anyone who does not make themselves? And here, right? That's the Hebrew, right? You have to make yourself hefker. What does hefker mean? When you say something is hefker, what does it mean? Nobody owns it. Okay? Erich Fromm speaks about the idea of having and being. Okay? And he says that when we live in the mode of having, he says modern times we become much more personalities that exist in the mode of having. I want to own, I want to have, it belongs to me, it doesn't belong to you, right? Even knowledge, it's mine, it's not yours, right? That's the mode of having, right? Even today, unfortunately, right, we very often relate, or some people relate to their children as if they're their possessions. You're going to do exactly what I say. I'm not going to allow you to do anything different. You're mine. I own you. Okay, and unfortunately the same mamash, in tragic and terrible circumstances between husbands and wives, right? We have become people who don't know how to live in the mode of being. When the Midrash says to us, hefgel, when it says to us this idea of being hefgel, it doesn't mean hefgel that, nothing. Like, it doesn't mean like as in you're nothing. On the contrary, it means that when you exist in this mode of being, you don't monopolize things. Exactly what we were speaking about. And therefore you are open to constantly re-becoming, right? If you live in a mode of being, you can constantly become. You're constantly growing, you're constantly changing, you're constantly becoming. And I want to show you what Martin Buber speaks about. He says like this: the man of today has no access to a sure and solid faith, nor can it be made accessible to him. If he examines himself seriously, he knows this, and may not delude himself further, but he is not denied the possibility of holding himself open to faith. If he is really serious, he too can open up this book and let its rays strike him where they will. He can give himself up and submit to the test without preconceived notions and without reservations. He can absorb the Bible with all his strength and wait to see what will happen to him, whether he will not discover within himself a new and unbiased approach to this or that element in the book. But to this end, he must read the Jewish Bible as though it was something entirely unfamiliar, as though it had not been set before him ready-made at school and after in the light of religious and scientific certainties, as though he had not been confronted all his life with sham concepts and sham statements which cited the Bible as their authority. Okay? Again, that last sentence is so powerful. What's Martin Buber saying here? Exactly what we've been speaking about. When you approach the Torah, approach it as if you're looking at it for the first time. Now, that's a super difficult thing to do. Especially for people who have brought up FFB, right, from birth, where you've gone through an education and you've the midrashim are in your head all the time, right? Or Rashi's explanation, or you know what happens next, right? Imagine trying to read the story of Yosef. It's the perfect example because it's mamash the perfect example, right? Imagine reading the story of Yosef for the first time, okay, and not knowing what's going to happen next. We're going to do this. We're going to do this experiment. We are going to do it as we read the text because it's such an important experiment, right? You're reading it for the first time. What do you think would happen next? Blind off anything you've known before, right? When you look at the Torah from that perspective, everything looks different. Read the Torah without preconceptions, but then read it with, because there is no way to understand the Yosef story without understanding the Avraham and Yitzchak and Yaakov story. No way. Okay? There's no way to understand why the brothers were so upset about the dreams without understanding the covenantal process. Without understanding until that moment, one person had always been chosen to be the person to carry the covenant. What do you think the brothers thought? One of them was going to be chosen. Who's chosen in the end? All of them were Bnei Yisrael. Okay? Without knowing that, without having that in our heads, the story doesn't also make sense. So what we are doing constantly is we're doing two things. We're on the one hand trying to read without any preconceptions, and on the other hand we're trying to read with foreknowledge. And when we do that dynamic, everything changes. Okay? Are there any questions, by the way, Tanya? I feel like everything clear so far. Okay. So, this is exactly what Martin Buber's saying. And he's saying, by the way, that these sham concepts and sham statements that cite the Bible as their authority are people that are exactly doing what he's saying, monopolizing the truth of the Torah. So this is what he says. He must face the book with a new attitude as something new. He must yield to it withhold nothing in his being, and let whatever will occur between himself and it. He does not know which of its saying and images will overwhelm him and mold him, from which the spirit will ferment and enter into him, to incorporate itself anew in his body, but he holds himself open. He does not believe anything a priori. He does not disbelieve anything a priori. He reads aloud the words written in the book in front of him. He hears the words he utters and it reaches him. Nothing is prejudged. The current of time flows on, and the contemporary character of this man becomes itself a receiving vessel. Okay, it's so beautiful how Martin Buber puts it. And by the way, you can almost imagine that that's exactly what he did. Okay, remember that Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig were the first to translate the Bible into German. Okay, and you see it in the way that Martin Buber writes about the Bible. That translation program, he threw his whole self into that translation program. And if you look at the translation, I don't understand German, but from people who have told me, it's the most fascinating translation, because it's the first time that it's translated in a very specific way that really, really engages with the text, rather than just kind of airy-fairy kind of translating it. So Martin Buber here is really telling us, try and approach the text as if it's a wilderness. The Or HaChaim again speaks on going back to this idea of modesty and humility, right? The second step which the Israelites had taken in preparation for Torah was to be modest and humble. Our sages say that only people who are humble and can be certain they will not forget their Torah knowledge. Their phrase is, Ein davar Torah mitkayimim ela b'mi shemashpil atzmo umasim atzmo k'midbar, right? Only somebody who literally throws himself down, exactly what the Rambam, exactly that image of bending down to the Torah. Okay, and Menachem Mendel, of course, the same idea, right? Only when you are like a wilderness, you're ready to have God's presence rest upon you and merit the light of the Torah like a wilderness. Means that you have not yet been touched by human hands, that you have never been cultivated or planted. You must rely on your own strength, as in the teaching, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? So what all of these opinions are saying to us are going back to this motif of hubris and humility, right? That there is an element of, on the one hand, we have to be hubris. Like we have to know that we are created beings, that we've been put in this world to uncover certain secrets of the Torah, that we've been put in this world to analyze, to understand, to seek knowledge. And yet at the same time, we should always be in that kind of mode of mishtachaveh, that mode of bending down, of humility. Okay? And more than that, and again, this goes back to what we were saying about the idea of the monopolization of ideas, and really this kind of notion that I need to see outside of myself different opinions. So David Hartman, in a book called A Heart of Many Rooms, really speaks about this idea of the differing interpretive traditions. And one of the idea here that I think is very, very important for us today is to be open to see outside of what I believe, to be open to see outside of what I think. And that comes to generally in life, but that comes very specifically to text analysis as well. When I approach the text as if it's a body, as if it's a being, not just something written on a paper. That's what the Torah is. It's a being. It's a being which, it reminds me of, I wrote an article for Rabbi Sachs's first Yortzeit, and I was thinking to myself that, why did he call his parsha shir, his parsha things that he sent out every week, covenant and conversation, right? Covenant and conversation, because that's exactly how he saw the Torah. He saw the Torah as a covenant, and a covenant means that I'm constantly growing, engaging, dynamic, and conversation. What does true dialogue? True dialogue means that I open myself up to the other, and that is exactly what learning Torah is. Learning Torah means I open myself up to the text. I open myself up to the words. I open myself up to different ways of understanding it. And by the way, that applies as we grow. As we grow, right? What will speak to me when I'm 15 is not going to speak to me when I'm 25 or 35 or 45, right? And every experience that we have in our life should change the way in which we look at things. Like one of the perfect examples is the story of the Akedah. For me, the story of the Akedah has traveled a journey. Right? When I was much younger, I saw it in a certain way, and now, and as I grow older, as you have kids and you see it differently and everything else, it grows, it's dynamic, it's organic, and it's affected by so many different things. That is when I approach the text as conversation, as dialogue, as covenant, right? A covenant means it goes like this. Covenantal relationships go like this. They're not like this. Flat. Someone once said to me, anything that's flat-lined is dead, right? It's dead. A living, organic relationship goes up and down. And that's the true with the text as well. And that's why for me, when people say there's a lot of things in the Torah that don't sit comfortably with me, of course it doesn't sit comfortably with you. It's not meant to sit comfortably. We're meant to fight it. We're meant to grapple with it. We're meant to feel moments of comfort with it. But that's what our tradition is. And when things don't sit comfortably, so let's engage. Let's try and unpack, and let's try and create a relationship, something dynamic. And this is what David Hartman, he says like this. There's a beautiful metaphor in the Tosefta that describes... Okay, that's definitely stopped. Because it's been 9 o'clock for like hours. Okay. I'm like... I don't understand. Kept looking at 9 o'clock. Okay. I mean, I know time stops for me sometimes, but there's a beautiful metaphor in the Tosefta that describes the kind of religious sensibility that Talmud tried to nurture. Make yourself a heart of many rooms and bring into it the words of the house of Shammai and the words of Hillel and the words of those who declare unclean and the words of those who declare clean. In other words, become a person in whom different opinions can reside together in the very depths of your soul. I think that sentence, by the way, is probably one of the hardest things for anyone to do, right? Differing opinions reside together in the very depths of your soul. That means that I'm constantly going to be what?
Grappling.
Exactly, right? There's no harmony. And this is going to be something we're going to address when we look at the Yosef narratives, because I'll just give you a promo, right, for the next couple of shows. The very first word that we see in the narrative we're going to look at is V'yeshev Yaakov, and Yaakov settled. And what does Rashi say? And then all his problems began again. Because the minute Yaakov thinks that he can settle, we don't settle. And I ask myself, really? What, we're constantly meant to be grappling? We're constantly meant to be in tension? We can't have a settled life? What does that even mean? I'm not going to answer it now because that's what we're going to look at, right? But this is something that David Hartman is saying to us here, that within our soul, we should always be listening to other voices. And I think it's so important on so many levels. On the most basic level of, don't think you're so great and your opinion counts. But also on the existential level of opening oneself up to something beyond oneself. By the way, that is also what religion is about, right? Belief in religion, belief in God, is belief in something beyond me and beyond the here and the now. And that's what modernity killed. That's what modernity killed, right? Modernity killed that idea. But we want to bring it back, but we don't want to bring it back in an authoritative way that it used to be, right? That the only person you really need to listen to is the church fathers or the rabbis. We want to bring it back in a spiritual way, in a way that speaks to us in our postmodern times. So he carries on. In other words, become a person in whom different opinions can reside together in the very depths of your soul. Become a religious person who can live with ambiguity. Again, can we? I'm asking the question. Ask ourselves, can we really live with ambiguity?
With great difficulty.
Right, exactly. Who can feel religious conviction and passion without the need for simplicity and absolute certainty? And again, I think today, in a post-pandemic, I say post-pandemic, can I say post-pandemic? Probably not yet. Look at us, I know. Okay, so maybe in a pandemic world, right, these questions were David Hartman asking her even more poignant, right? He's saying to us, can we live with ambiguity? Can we live with religious conviction without simplicity and absolute certainty? And to me, again, when we're talking about the Al-Qaeda narrative, to me that's so much the message of the Al-Qaeda narrative. So much of the message of the narrative of the Al-Qaeda is the idea that God told Abraham something, Abraham believed in something, then he told him something else, then he told him something else again. And the entire narrative is a narrative that literally throws Abraham into a constant oscillation between different opposing places, existential places. And the question God says to him is, can you live in that place? And by extension to us, Can we live in that place? And by the way, for many of us, the answer will be no. And therefore people choose, and no judgment, because I think it's super difficult. But when we choose a religious conviction that sits on an extreme, what we're choosing is certainty and non-ambiguity. Okay, that's essentially what we're doing. When we choose a religious or I should say not a religion, when religion manifests itself in extremes, what is being done there is to choose certainty and non-ambiguity. When religion expresses itself in oscillation, in a position of oscillation, we are maybe not choosing, but by a consequence of being in that position, we lead a life of ambiguity. And it's not easy. And sometimes we question, are we doing the right thing? Are we not doing the right thing? Okay? This then is the distinctive legacy of the Talmudic interpretive tradition, an understanding of revelation in which God loves you when you discover ambiguity in his word. He loves you for finding 49 ways to make this pure and 49 ways to make it impure. Revelation is not always pure and simple, but may be rough and complex. Okay? It's very, very powerful what he's saying. But what he's saying is that we need to sustain the gap. I think this is the challenge, right? Can we sustain that ambiguous gap? We, as human beings, we search for certainty. One of the natural proclivities is towards certainty. Totally, right? And what David Hartman is saying to us, that actually what we're being asked to, and by the way, a lot of people, when people say, oh, you're religious, you just want, it's easier for you to believe in religion. No, it isn't. Okay, no, actually it's not. Right? It would be far easier for me not to. It'd be far easier for me to opt for even a religious position where I've disregarded all those things that don't make me comfortable in the Torah, where I've disregarded all those things that don't make me comfortable in halakha. That would be far easier than living with that ambiguity and that oscillation and that constant, I'm not sure where I stand. Right? And that's what David Hartman is saying to us. And he says to us that even when we address the text, allow there to be within our learning experience a whole variety of different things, a whole variety of different opinions. Why? Look at our bookcases. Okay, just look at how many books are here. In every single one of those books of the Mefarshim, there is a different opinion about one verse in the Torah, right? In the Gemara, how many different opinions are there about halakha, right? Our tradition is a tradition that engenders multiplicity. Now, yes, when it comes to practicality, and we have to know what the halakha is, we have to have a bottom line. That's pragmatic, that's pragmatism. But that's not the essence of Judaism. Okay, the essence of Judaism is not the bottom line. The essence of Judaism is the multiplicity of opinions within. And that's exactly that's our aim. I'm bringing for you someone called Ariel Berger. Ariel Berger was a student of Elie Wiesel. I bought him in the past, okay? He came out recently, only a couple of years ago, with a book called Witness. And it's about the teachings of Elie Wiesel. It's a fascinating book, highly recommend it. Very, easy reading, but really, really powerful. And he goes through, it's kind of a bit autobiographical as well. He speaks about his own life, which for some people might not be so interesting, but when he speaks about Elie Wiesel, he speaks about Elie Wiesel in the classroom as Dafka, not Elie Wiesel, the classic that we know as, the post-Holocaust writer or whatever. He speaks about Elie Wiesel as, obviously that comes into it, but he speaks about him being a lecturer, a university lecturer, and how he engaged with his students, and the dynamic that happens in the classroom, and the way in which and it's absolutely fascinating. There's some really, really, in my mind, beautiful ideas that come out. And I just want to read to you something he says. He says, just as it helped us to see one another with fresh eyes, Professor Wiesel helped us to see familiar literature anew. Okay, again, going back to this idea of approaching the text as a wilderness. For students who grew up reading Genesis in church or synagogues, the challenge was to help them forget what they thought they knew. Okay, listen to the way the language, right? Forget what they thought they knew. Okay? One of our jobs as educators is to help students forget what they know so that they can stay alert to the text's nuances. Wiesel's conception of battleground demands that we shed our armor. I love this, okay? Typos are all mine. Demands that we shed our armor rather than use it for protection, okay? What his battleground is saying, what? Don't go with armor. Go like David did, right? When we studied the biblical story of David, he pointed to a powerful moment in the text. David, on his way to fight Goliath, was given the king's armor. For a battle this unequal with life and death stakes, armor makes sense. But David removed the armor, for it didn't fit him. The image has stayed with me as a symbol of a key concept, that vulnerability is the greatest weapon if you are brave enough to use it. And by the way, Brené Brown, those of you that are familiar with Brené Brown, she's a very popular psychologist. She's written a lot of books, and she did all her research was in the idea of vulnerability. I think it was vulnerability, right? And her book is called Braving the Wilderness, okay? And she speaks a lot about this idea that you can't have a true relationship without vulnerability. That a true relationship cannot exist unless both individuals are willing to be vulnerable, because vulnerability allows or extends ourselves to the other. When we put on armor, when we cover ourselves up, right? When we put on certain faces or certain coverings on a metaphorical level, we are protecting ourselves, which is great. We all want to protect ourselves. But when we do that to the person that we're meant to be closest to, or the thing that we're meant to be closest to, there can never, ever really be a truly authentic relationship. Okay? Test it out. Think about it. Think about it. Think about your own relationships. And think about the moments where you felt very, very close to a person, and the moments you felt distance. And you will always see that the moment that you feel closer is the moment when both people are vulnerable. Okay? It works. I really recommend her books. They are really, really incredible. By the way, it's the same. I'm just thinking about my teenage daughters. It's the same with kids, right? There's when your kids put up fences or put up blocks, or they, especially in teenagehood, they don't want to be vulnerable in front of you, or they don't feel that they can be vulnerable in front of you, and therefore distance happens, right? Here I want to do something. I'm going to read with you Brené Brown in a minute, but I want us to think while we're reading Brené Brown. She's talking specifically about human relationships, obviously, but I want us to think about it on a more abstract level. I want us to think about it with the text. When we approach text, when we approach the Torah, when we approach religion, when we approach God, right? For me, I've said this many times in the past. I've been totally honest. I find tefillah very, very, very challenging. Of all the things, for me, my greatest moments of relationship with Hashem come through learning rather than through tefillah. I find tefillah very, very challenging. But someone once said to me in terms of tefillah that if you allow yourself to if you let your guard down, right? Don't think too much. Don't think all the time. Just allow yourself to be and let your guard down. It's a totally different experience. And that is exactly this idea of taking the armor away. And the same when it comes to a text. Let us engage properly. So listen to what Brené Brown says. You are only free when you realize you belong no place. You belong every place, no place at all. And again, this is the wilderness, right? The price is high, the reward is great. True belonging in the spiritual practice of believing in and belonging to yourself so deeply that you can share your most authentic self with the world and find sacredness in both being a part of something and standing alone in the wilderness. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. And again, going back to the notion of being rather than having. People often silence themselves or agree to disagree without fully exploring the actual nature of the disagreement for the sake of protecting a relationship and maintaining connection. But when we avoid certain conversations and never fully learn how the other person feels about all the issues, we sometimes end up making assumptions that not only perpetuate but deepen misunderstandings, and that can generate resentment. Okay, so here what Brené Brown is talking about is the idea of vulnerability. Now, we speak about it a lot today, Okay, and by the way, in many, many ways, Corona has made us vulnerable on a universal level, on a human universal level. We all realize how vulnerable we are to something that's beyond our control, to something that and it humbles us. Vulnerability, what's the word I'm looking for? It generates humility. When I'm vulnerable, I realize I'm not all powerful.
But it generates fear, and the fear causes a backlash, and that's what we're seeing.
100%. Because what happens when I'm vulnerable is then my kind of fix to that is to create certainty.
No, but it's when you choose to be vulnerable, that's one thing. When you're forced to be vulnerable, it's a totally different thing. We are being forced to be vulnerable now.
100%. I 100% agree with you, and that's what I'm saying. Why vulnerability is so important in religion, and important in text reading, and important in so many other things, is because when used correctly, it generates humility. However, as you said, when vulnerability is forced upon you, when I return to something I can't think of it, but whatever, I basically go to a place of certainty. And certainty creates polarization. Certainty says, I'm right, everyone else is wrong, right? I have the truth, and I'm going to protect myself through it. And then I push people away. I push people out. As David Harmon says, I can't open myself up to all those many, many voices within. Okay? And that's why, okay, and here just time?
10:06.
Okay. And here we get to kind of the next part of this development. So we've spoken about humility, hubris and humility, majesty and majesty and humility, right? We've spoken about the idea of addressing the text in that way, of addressing religion in the way. We've spoken about the idea of how to approach the text. The Rambam speaks about the idea of mishtachaveh, of literally bowing down to the text. The Aviva Zornberg speaks about uncovering the mystery, uncovering the silences within the text and trying to understand it and trying to engage with it. We've spoken about the idea of making ourselves into a wilderness, of opening ourselves up, of cracking open that vulnerability and allowing ourselves to approach it so that we don't have one domineering idea that we don't allow anyone else in. And now we get to the idea of chevruta, because a chevruta, the text is that in-between dialogue, right? And that's why in Judaism, chevruta is so important. Okay, Rabbi Sachs always joked that in non-Jewish institutions, you go into a lecture and there's total silence, whatever. You go into a Bet Midrash or into a library and there's total silence. You go into a Bet Midrash and the one time this academic guy went into the how can you concentrate? Because there's so much noise and there's so much going on. And he said, Dafka, if you ask a lecturer a question that he can't answer, he's embarrassed. Right? He'll try to I'm not sure. But if you ask a Ram in yeshiva, right, a kushya, or you bring a kushya, they couldn't be happier. So excited. It was known that Rav Soloveitchik, if they just sat in his shiur klali and they hadn't come with questions, he would send them all home. I'm not interested, right? You had to come with questions. That's a chevruta. A chevruta is somebody who reflects back to you by opposing what you're saying. Okay? So the Pri-Haaretz says, there was Rav Menachem Mendel of Vishnik, he says like this: the Torah only stands firm in one who makes himself like a midbar hefker before those who are poor of mind and rich of mind, and he doesn't think of himself as better than his friend. Ve'eino gadol yoter michaveiro, adarabba, batal b'mitziut negdo ubazeh mitachdim. On the contrary, what does he do? Okay, he makes himself nullified before his friend, and therefore they become united and bound up with each other. Okay, on the one hand, you want to state your opinion, you want to know what your opinion is, and on the other hand, you have to make yourself a mizbah. You have to properly listen to the voice of the other. And again, I really, really believe that this is something that is desperately lacking in the world today. We hear only the people that sound like us, and we do not hear the people that don't sound like us. We do not hear the other opinions, and when we do hear the other opinions, we poo-poo them, right? What we need to be doing today is to be exactly as Rabbi Hartman spoke about, opening ourselves up to many rooms within our heart, many voices within our heart, and allowing ourselves to connect fully with the other in vulnerability, which is a very, very, very difficult thing to do. And that is going to be one of the, I'm going to come back to Source 13 next week. I'm going to finish the introduction next week. But one of the things that we are going to aim to do when we're looking at the narratives here is to really engage with the text and not be afraid of the problems. What do I mean by that? Number one, not be afraid to criticize, to look at what's going on in the stories and say, hold on a minute, were the brothers right? Were they not right? Okay, what does that say about my ancestors? What does that say about being in their, being Bnei Yisrael? What does it say about them? To look at Yosef. What did he do? How did he change? How did he develop? Yosef had Tzaddik. Why do we call him that? What was so righteous about him? Okay, to look at Yaakov and to ask the questions, to grapple with the text and say, where did he go wrong? Maybe he didn't go wrong. Maybe he knew all along what was happening. Maybe he sent Yosef purposely. Maybe he didn't. Right? What's going on in these stories? How can we unravel them? And to me, one of the perhaps main motifs that runs through this story, all of these stories, is the motif I'm using to introduce this whole class. And that's the motif of majesty and humility. We see it in the story with Yehuda. We see it even in the story with Reuven, which we're going to get to. We see it in the story with the brothers, and we certainly see it in the story with Yosef. Okay, all the time this oscillation between majesty and humility. And by the way, even we see it in the story with Yaakov, that at the beginning he wants to settle, and God says to him, you're not going to settle. Right? What is our purpose as a Jewish people? What are we meant to be doing? Where are we meant to be religiously? And again, I don't think we're going to have answers to all of these questions, but I certainly think that it's going to provide us with thinking material, grappling with these materials, and hopefully getting a much broader perspective on so often quoted story that in many ways is strange and weird and almost sounds childlike when we say it. When we talk about the brothers throwing in the thing and the pitch, and then he becomes the melech, and it almost sounds actually mythological to an extent. And I want to unpack it and show you that it's not mythological. There's some really profound truths that and psychologies and philosophy and theology that underlie all of the Yosef narratives. Are there any questions, comments? Okay, so I'll see you all next week. Thank you all for coming, and it's great to be back.
Hypocrisy? What do you mean? In that it's true, we don't want to judge ourselves, but when we're looked at and
Yes.
we say, do you know what I'm saying? It leads to being judged hypocrite.
Oh, people are saying you're being hypocritical.
Meaning, and that has to sit with you, because you can be going back and forth.
You're right.
So on the one hand, you're comfortable in your own, choosing to waver.
Yeah.
And yet you're looked at, aren't you doing, aren't you saying, aren't you?
You're right. You're right. Do you know, I just started reading Nicodemus' book. His latest one.
Right, his latest one.
I've only read the first chapter, but it so resonates with me what he says. And he says it's autobiographical. This is a book that says it's the closest I've